introduction. Famously known during the 1840s as the man who lived among the cannibals, Melville was neglected in the post-Civil War literary world. Shortly before his death in 1891, however, a revival of interest began, especially in England. This is just the next, 1102, the very last paragraph of the introduction. The true Melville revival, however, took off with essays published on the occasion of Melville's centennial in 1919. So for a while there, many years, 60, 70, 80 years, he had fallen out of favor as a literary icon. And it wasn't until 1919 that he was, that there was this Melville revival. In one of the most curious phenomena of American literary history, the neglected Melville suddenly came to be regarded in the rarefied company of Shakespeare as a writer who, as Melville said of Shakespeare in Hawthorne, had mastered the great art of telling the truth through the dazzling plenitude and sly indirections of his language. So, and he's been pretty much in the canon ever since then, one of the big classics. So, I thought it would be helpful to show how, let me get this a little bit smaller now, how Melville fits in with the Puritans, the Romantics, the Transcendentalists. Melville's major themes in both Moby Dick and Bartleby are basically these two items. Man's social responsibility as, like man as a social animal, a social being, and man's individual responsibility to his fellow man. As in the religious idea of, are we our brother's keeper? So under the social responsibility, he would think of government by God, the Word of God, government by the church, institutions of church, of law, and even the rules of Wall Street. When you see Bartleby, notice that the title is Bartleby the Scrivener, a Story of Wall Street. And that's kind of weird when you think about after you know what the story is about. But it fits in very well here with institutions. We were talking last week or the week before about church, state, and education systems, medical institutions, anything, that is a big building with governing administrators. Regarding his connection then to the Puritan work ethic and social commitment, ideas of predestination. Remember the Puritans with Jonathan Edwards, that we don't have free will, it's all God's will.
Social or individual?
Yeah. Well, no, this would be
social.
Yeah, under social. Like we don't really have. We're not individuals. We're under the will of God. God's got a big plan. So when we get to Bartleby, look at Turkey and Nippers. They're really cool characters, kind of opposites of each other, but they're standing as symbols showing us that society is only half functional. They only function half a day, and luckily they function in opposite halves. One is good in the morning, one's good in the afternoon, so together they make one good employee. But he can't fire either one of them. He tries to, the narrator. And this again it says the title is Bartleby the Scrivener, but this story is not about Bartleby. It's about the narrator, and about the narrator and his trying to decide where he fits between man's social responsibility and man's individual responsibility for the individual. Because that's what it comes down to, the narrator and his having to save Bartleby, try to understand him and save him, keep him alive. Okay, so Melville is walking this line between these two major themes. And under the individual responsibility, the government would be by self-reliant individuals, making up a democracy. Remember Whitman's democracy and the individual blade of grass. He would be thinking of the romantic and transcendentalism's self-reliance. Remember that Emerson's essay on self-reliance was against conformity. He was for non-conformity. He was pro the integrity of the self and pro free will. That if we would all be self-reliant, it would be all free will. But Melville has read all these. He's read Emerson and Thoreau and probably Whitman. I'm not sure, but I know about Emerson and Thoreau and Hawthorne. And with Bartleby, as with Moby Dick, he's testing, sort of arguing against Emerson. Not that he doesn't believe in those ideas, but he's just saying, let's give it the test. Let's create a character and see if these ideas work out. So he makes Bartleby and makes him stand as someone who is all self-reliance. And he's alone, absolutely alone. Bartleby is all non-conformity. Have any of you read this yet? Where he says, I prefer not to. He just, we'll get to it when we get to the examples after this. But he does not conform to anything. He says, I prefer not to do what my boss says. I prefer not to leave the building when my boss kicks me out. I prefer not to dine when I'm in prison and my boss has paid a man to bring me food. He rejects all institutions. He rejects all society. Melville says that what Emerson was talking about self-reliance and nonconformity, says that doesn't work when it's tested. So let's look at page 1110, and I'll show you a little example. This sounds like Thoreau. This is at the very top of 1110, and the narrator is saying, every copyist is bound to help examine his copy, as in proofread. He's just asking Bartleby to proofread his own work. Is it not so? Will you not speak? Answer. Bartleby says, I prefer not to. He replied in a flute-like tone. It seemed to me that while I had been addressing him, he carefully revolved every statement that I made, fully comprehended the meaning, could not gainsay the irresistible conclusion, but at the same time, some paramount consideration prevailed with him to reply as he did. So it's a considered choice of his own free will. He's not just flippantly saying, no, I would rather, rock and roll or sleep all day. He's thought about this. And the narrator says, you are decided then not to comply with my request, a request made according to common usage and common sense. He briefly gave me to understand that on that point, my judgment was sound. Yes, his decision was irreversible. So these have it kind of reminds me of civil disobedience. When Bartleby says, I prefer not to, that's exactly what Thoreau said about nonviolent revolution. That you stand up, you say what your preference is. If you do not support a state that allows for slavery, then you can prefer not to pay your taxes. Yeah. And it's also, I've got a little note up here about free will and predestination. It's also the paramount consideration is always that for human literature, for human nature. Do we have free will? And if so, what does it mean? We find we'll talk more about this later about what it means for Bartleby. I didn't mention about the predestination. This narrator goes back and forth between like predestination and his free will, and what is his responsibility for Bartleby. Now let me find where I put that. Oh, here it is on page 1121. It's an outright, he even quotes Jonathan Edwards here. You got to look at this. On page 1121, it's the second paragraph down, and he says, can you see this all right? Or should I make it a little bigger?
That's fine.
Ooh, that's very big.
No, that's fine right there.
Okay. Some days now passed, during which, at leisure intervals, I looked a little into Edwards on the will and Priestley on necessity. When he says Edwards on the will, he means Jonathan Edwards writing about free will and the concepts of, within Puritanism. Priestley was a little later, and he was sort of a pre-transcendentalist who believed in a benevolent God who was evident in the material world or in nature. So very, very transcendentalist. So here's the narrator looking into these two essays. Under the circumstances, those books induced a salutary feeling. Gradually, I slid into the persuasion that these troubles of mine touching the scrivener had been all predestined from eternity, and Bartleby was billeted upon me for some mysterious purpose of an all-wise providence, which it was not for a mere mortal like me to fathom. Yes, Bartleby, stay there behind your screen, thought I shall persecute you no more. You are harmless and noiseless as any of those old chairs. In short, I never feel so private as when I know you are here. At last I see it, I feel it. I penetrate to the predestined purpose of my life. I am content. Others may have loftier parts to enact, but my mission in this world, Bartleby, is to furnish you with office room for such period as you may see fit to remain. He's not really talking to Bartleby here, but it's like he's having this argument in his mind. And he's just come to this conclusion. It's like, okay, if there's a God, let let it be. I'm gonna let him just let it be. Because it must be God's will. There's nothing I can do about it. He has tried and tried to get rid of the scrivener who refuses to work.
So he's saying if there's a God, he'll take care of it.
Right. Predestination. God has the big plan. It's all his will. Let thy will be done, he's saying. But of course it's not that simple for the narrator. And the narrator is so funny, you guys. He's so cute. Don't think for a minute that this is like, it's serious, very serious stuff. But Melville has a sense of humor, and he's looking at the absurdity of this tall, pale, crazy guy who just won't do anything. He won't even lift. He won't do anything to live. It's the strangest idea. But that's what he was saying about if you really tested self-reliance and really tested free will, this is what might happen. You get a guy who all he can do to show his free will is to say, I prefer not to. Okay, so I've covered all